Hello, everybody. I'm ready to read the next couple of chapters of Crindle Cracks because the last chapter we read, we found out that possibly the reason the Crindle Cracks was in the sewer was because of Ruskin's dad. So let's find out what happened. Chapter 22. 11 years before, Winston had gone into the Dragon and the Golden Penny pub for a drink. He had just come home from work and was still wearing his uniform. He went up to the bar, ordered a lemonade, the only drink he liked at the time, and sat by himself at a little round table in the corner. Winston had no friends in the street and always sat alone. In fact, most people thought he looked ridiculous in his baggy green uniform and dusty peaked cap that wouldn't fit over his bush of frizzy red hair. Now and again, Winston tried to start talking to someone, especially Mr. Cave, whom Winston desperately wanted to be friends with, but no one took him seriously and always referred to him as Silly Splinter. That evening, when he went into the pub, most of Lizard Street was there. A younger Mr. Lace, still wearing his green scarf and sucking his pencils. A younger Mrs. Walnut, still running a grocer's shop and smelling of potatoes. A younger Dr. Flowers, still with his pocket full of handkerchiefs and sneezing non-stop. A younger Mr. Flick, still talking about films and wearing a green waistcoat with big brass buttons. And of course, Mr. and Mrs. Cave, still short and fat and smoking cigars. The only people who weren't there were Wendy, who was at home, Corky, who was at work, and Ruskin, Elvis, and Sparky, who weren't born yet. Dr. Flowers was talking to Mrs. Cave. You know, said Dr. Flowers, you really must get a tissue. A new sign painted for the pub. Tissue. The old one is all faded and ugly. That's what I've been saying, said Mrs. Cave, puffing her cigar. Mrs. Cave was expecting a baby and was even larger than usual. Mr. Cave, said Mrs. Cave, when are you going to buy a new pub sign? I don't need to buy a new pub sign, Mrs. Cave, said Mr. Cave. I'll paint one for myself. You can't paint for Tuffy, sneered Mrs. Cave. Of course I can paint, said Mr. Cave, puffing his cigar so much he almost disappeared in a cloud of smoke. I can copy things, Mrs. Cave. Well, in case you hadn't noticed, Mrs. Cave said sarcastically, you might be able to copy a few golden pennies, but dragons are pretty thin on the ground these days. Don't be awkward, Mrs. Cave, said Mr. Cave, puffing his cigar. Don't be stupid, Mr. Cave, said Mrs. Cave, puffing her cigar. The pub was so thick with the smoke from their cigars that everyone was coughing and spluttering. Mr. Lace opened a window to clear the smoke a little and then said, why don't you choose something that bears some resemblance to a dragon and copy that? Like what? Asked Mr. Cave. Well, Mr. Lace said, sucking his pencil thoughtfully. Like a crocodile. That's a good idea, said Mr. Flick. I've seen films in prehistoric times and the director has made crocodiles look like dinosaurs. But where would I get a crocodile from? Wondered Mr. Cave. And even if we could get one, wouldn't it be too big to get into the pub? Mr. Flick frowned and thought. Mr. Lace frowned and thought. Mrs. Walnut frowned and thought. Dr. Flowers frowned and thought. Mr. and Mrs. Cave frowned and thought. For a while, the pub was in silence, full of frowning and thinking. There is Winston sitting all alone with his zookeeper hat on. Think I know where this is going. And then a squeaky whisper of a voice said, I can get you a crocodile. The voice came from the small, red-haired zookeeper sitting by himself in the corner. Everyone stared at Winston Splinter. You can? Mr. Cave said, picking some tobacco from his teeth. Oh, yeah, Winston said. I work at the zoo, you see, and there's a crocodile there. It's only a baby. Bright green and the size of a shoe. I could easily sneak it out for you. At least, I think I could. No, I'm sure I could. I'm positive I could. I'll put it in my pocket and you can have it for a whole night. Will that give you enough time to paint it for your sign? Mr. Cave considered for a while, puffing his cigar. Finally he replied, "Yeah, I'm sure that's enough time." "Good," Winston said, getting to his feet and walking to the bar. "Tomorrow night, do you?" "Perfect," Mr. Cave exclaimed. "Let me get you a drink." "Lemonade, please." That night Winston went home and kissed Wendy on the cheek. "I think I've made a friend," he said. Chapter 23. The next day, going home after working at the zoo, Winston sneaked into the reptile house. He walked past the snakes and the turtles and the salamanders and went up to the glass tank containing the baby crocodile. The crocodile was sitting on a piece of wood floating in water. It had pointed teeth and sharp claws and stared at Winston with bright red eyes. Winston took the lid off the glass tank and put his hand inside. Clack went the crocodile's jaws, snapping at Winston's fingers. Winston withdrew his hand. He was scared, but he knew he had to get the crocodile, otherwise Mr. Cave wouldn't be his friend. He put his hand inside the tank for a second time. Clack, clack. Winston withdrew his hand again. He was shaking all over. "I know I'm scared," Winston said to himself, "but I've got to do scary things to get a friend." So he took a deep breath in and whispered, "Third time lucky," put his hand in the tank and grabbed the crocodile by its tail. Clack, clack, clack. Winston stared at the crocodile as it dangled from his fingertips. Gradually, the creature calmed down and stopped clacking its jaws. Winston put the crocodile in a canvas bag and ran out of the zoo. He went straight to the pub and gave the crocodile to Mr. Cave. "Be careful of its teeth," Winston said. "It's calm now, but it bites when it's angry." Mr. Cave took the crocodile and Winston upstairs to where Mrs. Cave and Mrs. Walnut sat on a sofa, talking about what they called their impending babies. Mr. Cave put the crocodile on the coffee table. "What a darling tail it's got," commented Mrs. Cave. "What cute claws," commented Mrs. Walnut. "And beautiful little teeth," commented Mr. Cave. Then added, "I'm going to start painting the new sign right away. I'll give the crocodile back to you first thing in the morning, Winston. Is that all right?" "Fine," Winston replied, happy someone had called him by his first name. Chapter 24. That night, Winston was woken by the sound of a siren. He looked out of the window and saw an ambulance outside the pub. Mr. Cave and Mrs. Walnut were helping Mrs. Cave into the back of the ambulance. Mr. Cave was wrapped in a blanket and kept saying, "Want a cigar? Get me a cigar." The ambulance drove away with Mr. and Mrs. Cave inside, and Mrs. Walnut went back into the pub. For a while, Winston thought nothing of it. He went back to bed and tried to sleep. Then, all of a sudden, he woke up and sat bolt upright, exclaiming, "My crocodile!" Winston rushed out of the house and, still in his pyjamas, ran to the pub as fast as he could. He knocked on the front door. "Mrs. Walnut!" cried Mr. Winston. "Mrs. Walnut!" He knocked again and again. Finally, Mrs. Walnut opened the door and asked, "What's wrong?" "My crocodile, Mrs. Walnut," gasped Winston. "Is my crocodile safe?" Mrs. Walnut, who had been sleeping, looked surprised. You're what?" she asked. "The crocodile I gave Mr. Cave to copy for his pub sign," explained Winston. "The crocodile I took from the zoo. Is it safe?" "Oh, goodness!" exclaimed Mrs. Walnut, covering her face with her hands. "Mr. Cave did paint the new sign, and then Mrs. Cave went into hospital to have the baby, and Mr. Cave went with her. And I was supposed to keep my eye on the crocodile, but oh dear." "You fell asleep!" cried Winston. "Let me in, quick!" They searched the pub, but the crocodile was nowhere to be seen. All night Winston searched Lizard Street. He looked in rubbish bins, behind drain pipes, under cars, but the baby crocodile had disappeared. Chapter 25. In the morning, Wendy found him sitting on the metal drain outside their house. He was covered in dirt and his eyes were swollen with tears. "The crocodile," Winston said. "Where could it have gone?" Clunk went the drain. At that moment, Mr. Cave walked into Lizard Street. He was smoking the biggest cigar anyone had ever seen. I have a son, cried Mr. Cave, giving cigars to everyone. Mr. Lace got a cigar, Mr. Flick got a cigar, Mrs. Walnut got a cigar, Dr. Flowers got a cigar, even Corky Pigeon, a younger Corky with darker hair and no walking stick, who was just leaving his home to go to work in the sewers. He got a cigar. Mr. Cave shoved a cigar in Winston's mouth. I have a son, Mr. Cave cried. His name is Elvis. Right, we will leave it there for now. So, we know how the poor crocodile got into the sewers. We know who let him out. We know why he was there. But I wonder what happens to the poor little crocodile. I imagine he'd be a little bit scared with all those humans and in the sewers, but we will find out tomorrow. Bye for now.